Welcome to another lecture on engineering mechanics. Today we will talk about friction. So let us start the lecture. Let us first see the definition of friction. The general definition of friction is it is the force resisting the relative motion of solid surfaces, fluid layers, and material elements sliding against each other. In our course, we will be dealing with rigid bodies only, so our definition will depend upon rigid bodies. So let us see the definition of friction in terms of solid surfaces. It is the contact resistance developed between the contacting surfaces when one of the bodies moves or tends to move over the other body. So if there are two bodies and there is a tendency of motion between the two bodies, then friction will develop between the contacting surfaces. It always opposes the motion and tendency to move. Suppose we want to move this body towards right, which is placed on this particular body, and let us say there is a tendency of the motion of the body towards right. Then this friction force will oppose that motion and it will act towards left between the contacting surfaces. The friction force is limited in magnitude and will not prevent motion if sufficiently large forces are applied. Yes, this is a very important point to understand. Between the contacting surfaces, there is a minimum value of friction which increases to its maximum value, and we call that as static friction or limiting friction. But when we apply large forces, then friction cannot prevent the motion and motion will happen. We know that friction is the necessary evil. So let us talk about few examples in which we will see that why friction is important and why it is not important. So let us first talk about its importance. The very general example is that we cannot walk without friction. And if we will take another example, we can say in many engineering applications such as brakes and clutches, friction is quite necessary as their working depends on friction. So let us talk about the evil part of the friction now. In many engineering applications such as bearings and gears and the flow of fluids in pipes, friction is quite undesirable because it results in the inefficiency of the system. Let us see the types of friction now. Friction is classified into two categories. The first is called as dry friction and the second one is called as fluid friction. Apart from these two main types, other types or subcategories are skin friction, lubricated friction, internal friction. So let us see these one by one. Let us start with dry friction first. Dry friction. It is also known as Coulomb friction. It resists relative lateral motion of two solid surfaces in contact. It is the phenomena when the contacting surfaces are dry and there is tendency for relative motion between those two surfaces. It is divided into two categories. The first one is called as static friction and the second one is called as kinetic friction. So let us see one by one the definition of these two. Let us start with static friction. Static friction acts between non-moving surfaces. Suppose we have a body and it is resting on the top of another body and we want to move this body towards right and we are applying some force for that. But suppose the body is not moving after the application of force along the surface. So if body is not moving, it means some friction is developed between the contacting surfaces which opposes the motion. So such a friction where the bodies are not moving, that friction is called as static friction. Next is kinetic friction. So kinetic friction acts between moving surfaces. So as you can see in this picture that there is a relative motion between the two surfaces. One body is sliding on the top of another body. So whatever friction will be there between the contacting surfaces, that will be termed as kinetic friction. Next is fluid friction. Let us see its definition. It describes the friction between layers within a viscous fluid that are moving relative to each other. Next we have lubricated friction. It is the case of fluid friction where a fluid separates two solid surfaces. So let us see one example. Oiling of door hinges. To avoid cracking sounds, fluid is introduced to reduce friction and to aid motion. Next is skin friction. It is a component of drag, the force resisting the motion of a solid body through a fluid. That force will be called as skin friction. As you can see in this example, this is the body. It is moving through a fluid. So there is a component of drag which resists the motion of the body. So that will be called as skin friction. Next is internal friction. It is the force resisting motion between the elements making up a solid material while it undergoes deformation. We have seen different types of friction forces. In our course, we will be dealing with dry friction only, that is Coulomb's friction. And under that category, we will be dealing with two categories, that is static friction and kinetic friction. In the next lecture, we will be discussing about the concept of friction and we will develop laws of friction from that concept.